You've been told Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was the most beautiful woman in any room she entered. The magazine said it. The fashion editors repeated it. TikTok has turned it into gospel. And some of you looked at the photographs, the angular jaw, the slicked back hair, the expression that toggled between bored and blank, and couldn't make the math work. One comment captured it better than any essay could. 3 words. I felt gaslit. That word is precise. Gaslighting is the replacement of your lived perception with someone else's authoritative version of events. For 25 years, a cultural apparatus has insisted that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's beauty was self-evident. Hitchcock blonde, second coming of Grace Kelly, the most luminous woman in America. While a significant number of people watched the mythology calcify in real time and thought, quietly, I don't see it. They were never given permission to say so. The consensus was declared, not demonstrated, and the declaration hardened into something that felt unchallengeable. Carolyn Jean Bessette was born January 7, 1966, in White Plains, New York. She grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, manicured lawns, old money adjacent, the kind of town that teaches you presentation before it teaches you anything else. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother remarried an orthopedic surgeon named Richard Freeman. Carolyn had twin sisters, Lauren and Lisa, and attended St. Mary's High School, where even yearbook photos show a young woman already calibrating her own image. While most girls wore the standard uniform skirts, Carolyn chose differently, signaling early that compliance was something she'd perform selectively and entirely on her own terms. At Boston University, she was magnetic. A college friend named Chris Applegate later recalled being grateful to have met her during their first week at school. She had a gift for making people feel individually selected from a crowd. That ability, making someone feel chosen, is a social skill, but it's also a professional one, and Carolyn would go on to professionalize it completely. After graduation, she joined Calvin Klein. She became a director of show production, overseeing red carpet styling and media strategy for one of the most image-conscious brands in American fashion. Her boss in the publicity department recognized her talent immediately. Carolyn Bessette was the person who decided which dress went on which actress at which premiere, how the brand would photograph on the red carpet, how the visual narrative would unfold across an entire season. She worked directly with celebrity clients at the Calvin Klein showroom in New York City, managing relationships with the kind of people who lived and died by how they looked when the flashbulbs went off. She understood fabric, lighting, the geometry of a neckline against a jawline. She understood that effortless is the most labor-intensive aesthetic in fashion, that looking like you aren't trying requires more precision than looking like you are. The distinction between publicist and celebrity was supposed to be clear. Publicists dress the star. They don't become the star. But Calvin Klein in the early 1990s operated at the intersection of fashion, celebrity, and media in a way that gave someone like Carolyn an unusual education. She wasn't just picking out gowns. She was learning, at a granular level, how public perception is manufactured, how a single silhouette choice at a premiere could rewrite a celebrity's narrative overnight, how the right photograph in the right outlet could shift an entire brand identity. She watched this machinery operate every day. She understood its levers and its tricks, and she applied every lesson she learned to herself. Her own wardrobe was the proof. The black trousers, the white shirts, the deliberately understated accessories. This was the output of a Calvin Klein publicist applying her professional expertise to her own body. The aesthetic that TikTok now worships under the label quiet luxury was strategy executed with professional-grade discipline. That reframing matters because the entire Carolyn Bessette beauty myth depends on the assumption that her look was innate rather than constructed. Peel back the assumption, and what you find is a woman who was exceptionally good at her job, and who applied that skill to her own life with a completeness that blurred the line between person and presentation, until nobody, including possibly Carolyn herself, could tell the difference. John F. Kennedy Jr. walked into the Calvin Klein showroom in 1992. Carolyn was assisting celebrity clients. He was, as always, the most famous person in any room he entered. People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive in 1988, a face so ubiquitous it had become wallpaper in dentist offices and hair salons across the country. He was still dating the actress Daryl Hannah at the time. Within a few years, Carolyn had replaced Hannah, moved into John's orbit permanently, and begun the process of becoming the most photographed and least understood woman in America. The cultural machinery that received her performed a specific function. The Kennedy story required a leading lady, and the leading lady had to be breathtaking. John had dated movie stars. He had dated models. The woman he married needed to look, in the eyes of the press, worthy of the bloodline, which in practice meant she needed to look like she belonged on a magazine cover at all times, including while buying coffee or walking a dog. Carolyn, the professional image maker, understood this assignment better than anyone alive. But there's a detail that complicates the origin story in ways the myth can't absorb. According to claims that have appeared in retrospective accounts, claims that haven't been verified through primary sources, Carolyn kept a copy of that 1988 People magazine, the Sexiest Man Alive issue featuring JFK Jr., tucked away in her apartment years before they ever met, years before the showroom encounter. If true, it rewrites the entire romance. She didn't stumble into a fairy tale. She identified a target, acquired his photograph, and engineered an encounter at the workplace where she dressed celebrities for a living. A media strategist who understood exactly how images create desire, keeping a magazine with a man's face in her home, then manufacturing a meeting. The whole thing starts to look less like a love story and more like a campaign executed with the same skill set she used daily at Calvin Klein. This claim may be apocryphal. It circulates because it answers a question the official narrative won't touch: how a publicist from Greenwich, Connecticut, ends up married to the most eligible man in America. The myth says destiny. The circumstantial evidence points toward professional competence applied to personal ambition. And whether or not that specific magazine existed in her apartment, the broader pattern, a woman trained in image construction pursuing the most image-saturated man in the country, doesn't require a single piece of physical evidence to be credible. It's the logic of her entire career made personal. On September 21, 1996, they married on Cumberland Island, Georgia. Tiny chapel, candlelight, a ceremony so secretive the press only learned about it afterward. A feat of operational security that delighted a public hungry for romantic mystery. Carolyn wore a pearl-colored silk crepe dress by Narciso Rodriguez, a then unknown designer who became famous overnight because of that dress. The images that leaked were instantly iconic. John kissing Carolyn's hand, the two of them barefoot on a dirt road. They looked like the couple the Kennedy mythology demanded: young, beautiful, impossibly romantic. And according to another unverified but widely circulated claim, inside the Tribeca loft she shared with John, that apartment in the industrial chic neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, Carolyn kept ornate picture frames on display. Empty ones. Beautiful objects, deliberately positioned, containing nothing behind the glass. The detail hasn't been confirmed through primary biographical sources and should be understood as a claim, but it persists because it functions as an almost unbearably precise metaphor for the mythology itself. Everything about Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's public story has perfect composition, gallery-worthy. Lean in close enough to see what's actually on display, and the space behind the glass is bare. The locked door of that same loft told a different kind of story. The single most engaged with comment in the entire audience dataset around Carolyn Bessette Kennedy is this: a marriage can't last without emotional connection. Viewers who consumed the available evidence, interviews, documentary footage, insider accounts, arrived at a verdict that had nothing to do with tragedy and everything to do with recognition. They'd seen this marriage before, in their own lives or in the lives of people they loved. Two people who looked extraordinary together and couldn't figure out how to be ordinary together. Reports from the couple's inner circle describe a marriage that began deteriorating almost immediately after that candlelit ceremony on Cumberland Island. The fights circled the same wounds endlessly. Leaving the apartment, having children, Carolyn's increasing refusal to participate in the public life that was oxygen to the Kennedy family's survival. One account of their final weeks captures it bluntly. Kennedy didn't want to have this fight again, but he also knew there was no way around it. The toll was mutual and worsening. The existence of leading a public life went from tolerable to excruciating for both Carolyn and John, and the trajectory only pointed downward. The question of children went unresolved, circling endlessly under the conditions of a marriage already buckling. He wanted her beside him at public events, at Kennedy family gatherings, at the kinds of social obligations that came packaged with his last name. She wanted to stay in the loft. The Tribeca loft functioned simultaneously as her sanctuary and her prison. He wanted out of it. She couldn't leave it. Paparazzi had converted the sidewalks surrounding their building into a permanent gauntlet, fueling the anorexia speculation and drug rumors that tabloids ran with gleeful regularity. The famous Central Park footage made the private public in the most humiliating way possible. Grainy video, shot from a distance by a paparazzo who sold it to tabloids. John grabbing at Carolyn's hand, Carolyn pulling away, visibly upset. A dog leash tangling between them while they argued, with the kind of body language that makes strangers look away. That footage circulated nationally. For many viewers, it was the first visible crack, not in the marriage, which they couldn't see, but in the frames surrounding it, which they could. Rosemarie Terenzio, John's executive assistant and one of the few people both he and Carolyn trusted, witnessed the dynamic from inside the relationship. Her accounts, shared in interviews and her own writing over the years since their deaths, describe a couple trapped between genuine affection and structural incompatibility. John was restless, social, political by instinct and upbringing. Carolyn was increasingly withdrawn, anxious and claustrophobic inside the role of Kennedy wife. He thrived on public energy. She was being destroyed by it. The marriage didn't lack love entirely. What it lacked was the kind of daily emotional connection that holds two people together when the cameras turn off and the apartment door closes. And that door was closing more and more often, with Carolyn on the inside and John looking for a way to pull her out. A marriage publicly framed as a fairy tale, privately operating as a siege. Two people who chose each other for reasons that may have had less to do with emotional compatibility than with what the other person represented. He was the prince, she was the image maker who knew exactly how to stand beside one. Beautiful framing, bare interior. Into this fracture steps Michael Bergen. Bergen was a model who achieved minor fame on a show about lifeguards. The kind of career that doesn't quite explain why a woman 20 years after your relationship would build a book around your name. 5 years after Carolyn's death, in 2004, Bergen published a memoir called The Other Man. The timing alone raises questions. 5 years is long enough for public grief to settle, short enough for the name recognition to still sell copies. Every single brick in the book's demolition of the fairy tale narrative comes from a single source: Bergen himself. The woman he's writing about can't respond. She couldn't respond when the book was published, and she can't respond now. He was Carolyn's boyfriend before she became Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Their relationship began during her Calvin Klein years. According to his account, the relationship overlapped with Carolyn's early courtship of JFK Jr. He alleges that during their time together, Carolyn had 2 abortions. He describes a miscarriage in April 1996, just months before the Cumberland Island wedding, with paternity that was, by his telling, unconfirmed. Each claim escalates. If the abortions are true, they reveal a woman managing reproductive decisions within a tangled web of relationships that the fairy tale erases completely. If the miscarriage claim is true, Carolyn walked down the aisle in that iconic Narciso Rodriguez dress, carrying a grief, or a secret, or both, that the candlelit photographs could never reveal. If any of it's false, a man exploited a dead woman's memory to sell books 5 years after she died off Martha's Vineyard. Either way, the wedding photographs look different. Bergen pushes further. His most incendiary claim is that his intimate relationship with Carolyn continued, intermittently, throughout her marriage to John. He doesn't frame it as a single relapse during a rough patch. He describes a pattern, a parallel track running alongside the public marriage the world was watching. The claim arrives uncorroborated, sourced entirely from a memoir designed to generate sales, about a woman who died at 33 and can't offer her version. The corroboration is absent, and that absence gets read as confirmation by people who want Bergen's claims to be true, and as irrelevance by people who don't. Absence is a Rorschach test, and Bergen knew that when he published. And then he detonated his own credibility mid-sentence on camera. During an interview discussing Carolyn's lifestyle, Bergen stated, "There was drug use, yes, but it was modest. No, actually, that's wrong. In Carolyn's case, it was minimal." The self-correction is almost comical. He recalibrates from modest to minimal, as though downgrading by a single adjective transforms cocaine use into something suitable for polite company. A viewer demolished the distinction with surgical efficiency. Give me a break. Drug use is drug use. There's no such thing as minimal use of cocaine. That stammering correction reveals nothing about what Carolyn Bessette Kennedy did or didn't put into her body. What it reveals is that the man making uncorroborated claims about abortions, ongoing affairs, and miscarriages with uncertain paternity can't hold a consistent position within a single sentence. He corrects himself in real time, on camera, about a relatively minor factual claim, and the audience is supposed to trust his account of far more explosive allegations. The math doesn't work. He knew Carolyn intimately enough to possess some version of the truth, and unreliably enough to have warped it past recognition. The more damning possibility is that he invented details wholesale, monetizing a dead woman's secrets, or fabrications, because the market for Kennedy mythology never closes. The toxicology report from the crash was reported as negative for alcohol and drugs of abuse. That clears Carolyn on July 16, 1999. It says nothing about prior history. Whatever role substances did or didn't play in her life, the only detailed account comes from a narrator who contradicted himself between 2 words separated by a dash. Every Bergen claim should be weighed with that self-correction ringing in the background, because a man who can't keep his story straight about one thing shouldn't be trusted implicitly about anything. Separate from Bergen, separate from the tabloid rumors, a darker thread runs through the final chapter of Carolyn's story, one that shifts the stakes from personal drama to something with institutional teeth. Valentino Garavani, the Italian fashion designer, was one of Carolyn's few genuine confidants in the world she'd married into. He knew fashion, he knew fame, and he knew the Kennedy machinery from the outside, which meant he could see things that those inside it couldn't, or wouldn't. According to claims that have circulated in retrospective accounts, though primary source verification hasn't been established, Valentino told Carolyn directly, They will disappear you like they disappeared Marilyn Monroe. Whether he spoke those exact words or someone attributed them to him later, the warning names a historical pattern that doesn't require Valentino's voice to be real. Women consumed by proximity to the Kennedy family. Marilyn Monroe, Mary Jo Kopechne. Names swallowed by a dynasty that ran on mythology and discarded the people who couldn't sustain their assigned role in it. Carolyn, by the final year of her marriage, appears to have felt this pattern closing around her, not as something she'd read about in history books, but as something she was living through daily. The disappearing was already underway long before July 16, 1999. By the final year of her marriage, Carolyn had become increasingly isolated, reluctant to leave the Tribeca loft, gripped by a mounting paranoia about paparazzi that wasn't paranoia at all. It was an accurate reading of her circumstances. The woman who had once navigated Calvin Klein showrooms and Manhattan social events with authority now struggled to walk to a corner bodega without triggering a panic response from the flashbulbs she knew were waiting outside. Events, restaurants, public sidewalks, she withdrew from all of them, contracting her world down to the narrow corridor between the loft's front door and whatever car was waiting to ferry her somewhere she didn't want to go. The paparazzi stalking was real, relentless, and operated with institutional impunity. Princess Diana died in a Paris tunnel in August 1997, and even that catastrophe didn't fully reform the culture that produced it. Emerging scholarship has since identified Carolyn Bessette Kennedy specifically as a case study in how 1990s female public figures were subjected to a surveillance culture that would later be recognized as harassment. One such study described her as the fashion executive who was continually stalked by paparazzi, a clinical sentence that reads as neutral description and functions as an indictment of an entire industry. The tabloids speculated about eating disorders during this period and ran those speculations as entertainment rather than evidence of a woman in crisis. Headlines were written with the kind of gleeful concern that disguises cruelty as interest. Carolyn was providing content for an industry that profited from her deterioration, while simultaneously demanding she maintain the beauty standard they'd assigned to her. The machinery consumed its own product. There's a brutal contradiction embedded in this arc. A woman who may have pursued fame, who may have kept a magazine with a prince's face, who chose to marry into the most public family in American history, was then destroyed by the very visibility she'd sought. But calling it a contradiction flattens something more complicated, because what the myth erases is that Carolyn was disappearing long before the plane went down. She was vanishing inside that loft, inside that marriage, inside a mythology that demanded perfection while offering her no room to be human. The disappearing Valentino allegedly warned about wasn't a future threat. It was already happening. The crash on July 16, 1999, just made it permanent. John F. Kennedy Jr. piloted his Piper Saratoga from Essex County Airport in New Jersey that evening, headed for Martha's Vineyard. Carolyn and her sister Lauren sat in the rear-facing seats behind him. They were flying to attend his cousin Rory Kennedy's wedding weekend. They never arrived. The plane went into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Carolyn was 33 years old. Lauren was 34. John was 38. And then the mythology executed its final, most dishonest maneuver. During Carolyn's lifetime, media coverage was mixed at its most generous and vicious at its norm. Cold, the tabloids called her. Difficult. Reporters ran drug rumors alongside anorexia speculation, alongside the Central Park fight footage on heavy rotation. Unflattering photographs appeared with captions engineered to wound. She was framed as an interloper, a publicist playing princess, a woman who had gotten above her station and couldn't handle the altitude. The coverage was hostile enough, sustained enough, and cruel enough that, according to claims that have surfaced in retrospective accounts but remain unverified, Carolyn kept a box of hate letters locked inside the Tribeca loft. Not discarded, collected, preserved, as though cataloging evidence of her own destruction served some purpose she couldn't articulate, or as though throwing them away would mean pretending the hatred didn't exist when she had to walk through it every time she opened her front door. After the crash, the press performed an inversion so complete it should have given the public whiplash. Overnight, the woman they'd branded cold and difficult was repackaged as an ethereal angel, a tragic princess, a fashion saint whose taste was decades ahead of its time. Instagram accounts curated her outfits into aspirational mood boards. TikTok compilations set her photographs to Mazzy Star and labeled the aesthetic quiet luxury, an aesthetic that, while she was alive, the same cultural apparatus had dismissed as cold or boring, or trying too hard to look like she wasn't trying. 25 years of cultural production have since been dedicated to transforming the woman the press mocked in life into the icon they worship in death. Not because new evidence emerged, because a dead woman can't contradict the story you build around her. The myth required her silence, and death guaranteed it permanently. This is the specific mechanism of the gaslighting that the audience has been feeling without having language for it. If you lived through the 1990s coverage, you remember the tabloid Carolyn, the one who fought in Central Park, who wouldn't leave her apartment, who the press treated as an inconvenience to the Kennedy brand rather than a human being trapped inside it. And now you're told, with the full authority of a consensus that solidified in her absence, that she was perfect, ethereal, an icon, the most beautiful woman in any room she entered. Your memory of the real-time coverage doesn't match the posthumous revision, and that dissonance has been sitting in your chest for a quarter-century without a name. So here's what the evidence actually supports when you strip the framing away. The beauty consensus was declared, not demonstrated. A professional image maker's self-branding absorbed uncritically by a media ecosystem that needed the Kennedy leading lady to be breathtaking. The marriage lacked emotional connection by the account of everyone who observed it closely. The fairy tale romance may have been reverse-engineered from a magazine clipping by someone who understood exactly how such campaigns are built. The most detailed insider account of her private life comes from a narrator who can't maintain a consistent claim within a single sentence. And the posthumous mythology was constructed by the same media apparatus that tormented her while she lived, repackaging cruelty as reverence, because reverence sells better, and the subject is no longer available to object. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy left behind two kinds of objects in that Tribeca loft: ornate picture frames, reportedly empty, beautiful objects containing nothing, displayed as though the presentation alone were enough. And, if certain unverified claims are to be believed, a locked box of hate letters that documented everything the current myth pretends didn't happen. One represented how the world wanted to see her. The other represented how the world actually treated her. The mythology chose the frames. It always does. A gorgeous exterior is easier to worship than a human being is to understand. Everything she left behind was either empty or full of pain. A real woman died at 33, and she deserved better than the myth, and she deserved better than the hate mail. The world gave her neither honesty nor kindness while she was alive. The 25 years since haven't changed the ratio, just the packaging. The least we can do, this far out, is stop pretending the frame had something in it. Subscribe for more stories like this.